Well, what's often misunderstood is that people say a concussion ended my career, and that's actually incorrect. Because if that was the case, the Monday night game when I had the concussion, I wouldn't have played again, and I was back playing um, a little over a week later. But what happened to me, I just improper care of the actual injury. Because when the head trauma that I got on the Monday night game in Kansas City was severe, and I try to explain. When I say severe, what does that mean? And people misunderstand head trauma and severity of head trauma. So they will take, for example, if somebody loses consciousness, that's a severe head trauma, and not necessarily. It's a sign of head trauma, but it's not a sign of severity because once you regain consciousness, it's no longer a sign or a symptom because you've regained consciousness. So there's only two things that can give you a sign of severity, and that is cognitive recall and stability. And so that's why those things are measured to give you the sense of how severe it was. And you don't even have to lose consciousness to have really severe cognitive recall and severe immobility. That's how you diagnose, how severe it is. And I had a severe one. I mean, I couldn't remember where I was, what they had talked to me a half hour before we even got on the plane. So that's like almost 2 hours later after it had originally happened. We fly home, and I still can't recall stuff. I'm still not very stable. And, 4 or 5 hours after head trauma, that's considered severe. A lot of people, recover immediately. They start recalling things. They may have missed a certain spot during the trauma, but when things were asked of them, going forward, they remember things. Yeah, I remember you talking to me here. Like, I wouldn't remember any of that. But anyway, they cleared me to go back and play 5 days later over the phone. Like, they didn't even come see me. And that's like archaic. Even in 1994, that was an archaic way to look at a player or a patient, period, for any type of head trauma. And I only answered one question. The question was, how you feel? And I had a raging headache, but I mean, and back, you always have to go perspective. What did we know back then? Because people will use the information you have today and go, oh, why didn't you say you had a headache and stuff? No player was ever told at that time, here's some symptoms that you need to watch for. Here are some things that you need to be alert and aware of. And if you have them, share them. Well, none of that was said. And clearly in 1994, you know, um, to see a patient, to see some player or somebody who has had some type of trauma like that is like, how do I put this? Like math 101. I mean, you see somebody after they've had something severely happen to them, especially in the brain area. And they just failed to do that. And unfortunately, I returned to play. I suffered a similar type of trauma. I went into cardiac arrest. Obviously, my career was over. Um, I laid in intensive care for several days, and the recovery process, going to what they're doing here with the facility, what I resonate with it is that I was on my couch for weeks. I had no hope, no purpose. I'm starting my life over at age 30. Every day I go the same routine, point fingers, cast blame, make excuses, become angry, and nothing changes. Go figure. But it wasn't really until I took some ownership of where I was. I quit blaming doctors, quit blaming the Bears, quit being angry at the league. Even though they had drastically made mistakes, that wasn't getting me off the couch. That's not helping you move forward in life. Was not helping me. And when I go back to this overall facility and what they're trying to do with it, man, you could surely help some people through some arduous times in some dark spaces that not everybody gets out of. And the more you stay in that darkness, the harder it is to get out of there. But there's just so much hope for the proper treatment, proper care, and the tools that do exist that can help people. And that is always, I think, forgotten or not shared enough because there's more opportunities and more great things from a recovery aspect and a rehab aspect that exists today than ever before. And, aside from tissue damage or, skull structure, the bone being skull damage, I mean, oftentimes a lot of head trauma can be recovered and repaired for. the brain is fascinating from that perspective of its ability to repair and relearn and retrain itself and rehab itself. So hopefully we can help a lot of people that are in those moments, because like even my rehab took almost 2 years before it cleared up.
Yeah, you had to learn to like read and talk again and everything, right?
Well, I had to learn how to read again. That's where it actually all started. That was my biggest challenge, is reading. I couldn't leave the house. I had to have people with me when I left, especially in Chicago. Now, it was interesting. I couldn't leave my home in Chicago or I'd get lost. I mean, I would have no idea where I was at. But I went back to Pittsburgh, to my place in Pittsburgh, and I had, because I'd been there for almost 10 years. I had memories of where I was there. I knew things there. I was a little more familiar there than I was in Chicago. I struggled more in Chicago than I did Pittsburgh.
Yeah. How hard was it for you to get out of, I guess, that like victim and blame mindset? Because I remember when I went through it, I was in a very similar, very similar mindset. Had a chip off my shoulder. I was like, fuck the league. Didn't want to watch football, and it took a long time to put that ego aside. Being a elite athlete for for probably two years until I started to do that. Was that hard for you?
But it's probably one of the darker moments I've ever had. I referred to it that I laid on the couch. Because when I speak, I actually talk about this moment, and everybody, listen, probably has been in this moment. Not as dark as the moment I'm talking about, but something happened to you. You either did it to yourself or somebody did it to you, and often it's when somebody else does it to you that this I think plays a bigger role. Um, they took advantage of you. They did something wrong to you. And in my case, obviously, it was career ending, but it was life changing. And it almost took my life. Just the incompetency of the doctor to treat me in the way he had treated actually many other patients who were less severe as I was. Um, for the NFL to come in and support how he handled me, that is the proper protocol and care for a player. Um, there, there was, I had, I, well, I won the court case on it. So I have all the evidence and have the truth of the evidence of how wrong things were done to me. That being said, when you harbor ill will like that, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. I finally realized laying on that couch, it was months into it. I'm like, nobody's coming to get me off this couch. I have a responsibility to get myself off the couch. I need to stop pointing. What the doctor did, yes, unacceptable. I mean, as atrocious as you could think, but that ain't changing. And if I'm going to let that be a cornerstone of my life, that's where I'm going to stay. And I chose on that day not to stay there, and I was done staying there. And I got off the couch. I made a return call to actually Lynn Swann, that had left me several messages, and he was trying to help me move over into my life's work with broadcasting. And I felt so sorry for myself. This is how depressed and ugly, dark it gets. You're like, well, I'm not going to return his call. He's literally got to come to this house and beg me to do it. I'm like, the irrationality that you come up with and the stupidity, it's just, it just gets darker and darker and uglier and uglier. And I just like, um, enough. You're responsible for this. You're the one that's dug this hole deeper for you. And if you're going to let all that stuff keep doing that to you, then you're going nowhere. And once I got off the couch, and I'm not saying everything. I mean, yes, everything did change, but it wasn't just okay. Now it's over. I mean, it was a 5-year journey before I really had recovered. I'd really, worked my way through so many things that had affected me, and I had to deal with at that time. But had I not made that first step, then I wouldn't have ever got there. And that's what I try to share with people, is we all have a responsibility. We got to take ownership of our journey. We are the CEO of our life, and we are responsible for going forward. When somebody does something wrong, can't control that, but you can surely control how you deal with it, how you handle it, how you harbor it, how you let it go, how you move on from it. and that taught me to be better at that. And I'm much better at that than I was then. And and I had it not been for that, I probably wouldn't be where I am today based on all the experiences, in that dark moment. Helped me with other dark moments in my life and made them much easier.
Was that the hardest thing during that 5 year journey, like physically and emotionally, just taking that first step, or was there other things that were coupled on that?
It was one of the hardest because it's a good question. Because is it the hardest? Does it get easier? In a way, it got okay. Yes, the first one was to finally stop letting all that trash weigh me down. Okay, to let that go after I'd done it for months and months, and nearly 6 7 months, to let it go. But then there started to become some peace and freedom to it. Like it wasn't weighing me down. Like I could program myself into some other things, think about other things that are good at positive energy things that were helping me go to where my next chapter was going to be. But one of the harder things, I think, the next hard thing was because I was still struggling cognitively. I transitioned into television, and now you talk about some cognitive skills. If you got to have television, television. I tell people this: it's like having a pine tree of information, and you got to whittle it down to the stump and present that. Well, that's even hard for a well trained cognitive human. For somebody that was as scrambled as me, actually, sometimes I could only remember a stump, and then that became hard. And then I would lose that when I would start talking. So to remember things, and here's one of the problems that I had, so people understand what I mean by that is I had the trauma that I dealt with. It was hard for me to hold information. You don't realize, how powerful our brain is, how extraordinary the brain is, and all the things it's really doing. Like in this conversation, geez, the lights you're dealing with, you're listening to me, you're thinking of other things. You might even be wandering into like tomorrow what you should be doing. Okay, right? You have a lot of things around you
Dude,
going on.
I couldn't have done that 5 years ago after my injury.
Well, okay, well, yeah, you would be someone who could identify with it. I was so bad that one of my first shows I ever did, they started talking and I just lost everything. And I was trying to listen to what they were saying and I forgot everything. And I had no ability to recover from it. And thank goodness we taped that show. Um, and I got some luck in the shows that we did early on. We taped before I went into some live stuff, which helped me. But how I survived is all I would do is I would shut everything off and just think about what I had to say. And that's just how I would do it. So I couldn't carry on a conversation. I couldn't listen to you have some dialogue. You could take me down another road, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. If you did that, I'd be like completely, just absolutely done. And
That
that
must have
took
been pretty
several years.
scary, man. Being in front of like you were ESPN after that, right?
Yeah, and so like I'd step all night and I'd practice in the mirror, and I would just practice what I had to say. That's all I could really hold on to. I would not listen to what anybody else said. I only talked when they addressed me, and I didn't even listen to that. I just knew what I was going to say, and I said it.